Fire Emblem Three Hopes is an incredibly flawed game, but a nearly flawless sequel. That sentence will need a lot of explaining, most notably the use of the word sequel, but if you're looking for a quick summary, there it is. This game has a lot going against it, not the least of which is the problems inherent to its genre, and that's probably an instant deal breaker for a lot of people. But if you enjoy this type of gameplay or manage to push through it, you'll find a surprisingly thoughtful experience that might also be the best Musou game ever made. Three Hopes is a follow-up to two games, those being Fire Emblem Warriors and Fire Emblem Three Houses, both of which were also collaborations between Koei Tecmo and Intelligent Systems. I would consider myself to be a fan of both the Warriors franchise and the Fire Emblem franchise, which made it pretty awkward when I played the previous Fire Emblem Warriors title and thought it was pretty bad. It wasn't a terrible game or anything, it was just sort of aggressively mediocre. Everything from the selection of characters to the bland and forgettable main story to the lackluster implementation of Fire Emblem mechanics just felt so inconsequential that I pretty much forgot the game existed until making this video. But despite this, I was incredibly excited for Three Hopes. Koei Tecmo had reportedly done the lion's share of the work on Three Houses, so having the same team work on a spin-off title with the same characters had me cautiously optimistic. And considering Three Houses had a lot of struggles in basically every area that wasn't character writing, I was perfectly open to the admittedly drastic transition from turn-based strategy to whatever the hell you would call Musou gameplay. We're about to talk spoilers for Three Houses, so here's your warning. We'll keep the Three Hopes spoilers to a minimum. To set my own expectations, there were three things that I wanted to see from Three Hopes. First, I wanted to see the main story do justice to Edelgard and Claude's stories. The twist in which Edelgard serves as the primary antagonist in most routes for Three Houses was admittedly pretty cool, but she wasn't really done justice as a main character in her own route. Claude also never really got explored in any meaningful way. He was mostly a passive bystander in his own route and barely existed in the others. Second, I wanted to see the war aspect of the game more fleshed out. Three Houses was fantastic at setup, but struggled with payoff, and it seemed like a clear avenue for improvement. Lastly, and most simply, I wanted to see better gameplay compared to Fire Emblem Warriors, considering how apathetic I was towards that title. Three Hopes starts with a new main character, a distractingly purple-haired mercenary named Shez getting absolutely bodied by previous main character Byleth. After he and all his friends die, he is brought back to life by a gremlin that lives inside of him. He then meets the leaders of the three nations of Fodlan, fights some bandits, and is recruited to Garreg Mach after saving their lives. This is basically the same setup as Three Houses, which is fine since it saves quite a bit of time. In fact, the game is very much in the business of saving time. After only a few chapters, you're thrust into the same time skip that took Three Houses 20 hours to get to. This is why I refer to the game as a sequel at the start. While it takes place in an alternate timeline rather than being a direct sequel, it very much assumes that you've played Three Houses. In doing so, it basically completely skips all the setup that game did and proceeds as if you already know the characters and their backgrounds. While this may seem like an awkward choice, I personally think it's the best one they could have made. Going through another absurdly slow boil before getting to the war phase of the game would have probably soured me on the entire experience. What takes place then is a story which is focused almost entirely on a war between the three nations of the world. It's the type of story that's not going to be to everyone's tastes. There's a lot of dry talk of strategy and war councils, and while that's not exactly a glowing endorsement, it fits in really well in a strategy RPG franchise. For a series that's been around for as long as it has, Fire Emblem has been pretty inconsistent in whether or not it wants to tell war stories or more traditional JRPG fare where the battles are just against like monsters or bandits or some shit. That's not the case here. It uses the setting and characters from Three Houses to tell a more complete version of the continent-spanning war that the second half of that game tried to tell. So that's number 2 on the list taken care of, but what about number 1? The game is once again split into 3 routes, each taking a look at a different side of the same war. Of these 3, the Blue Lions route is by far the weakest, mostly due to how its characters were already pretty well fleshed out. Unlike the other 2 houses, Blue Lion's characters were involved in parts of the story even before the route split, and Dimitri's character arc in the second half of the game was really well done. As such, there's not as much new ground to explore here. The other 2 routes provide much more entertaining stories by pushing into areas 3 houses didn't use. First, Edelgard's route provides something that should have been in the last game, which is a route where she's actually the protagonist. Three Houses' Crimson Flower route felt tacked on and shallow, but here you see her as a much more effective leader. She diverts plans to save comrades, seems to genuinely care for her friends, and doesn't resort to making a deal with underground mole people in order to carry out her agenda. She finally gets a chance to shine, and despite the fact that she's obviously the instigator of the war, she's a lot easier to sympathize with. Claude's story is also quite a bit more complex. His ambitious nature is explored a lot more fully, with him trying to seize control of his nation and facing down former family members who are in his way. He also jumps in and out of a few different alliances during the war, showing the shrewd scheming side of him that Three Houses love to tell you about but never actually showed you. Of the three main lords, Claude was the only one that was never really portrayed as morally grey, and that's very much fixed here. These stories nail pretty much everything that Three Houses missed on, while also providing satisfying war stories of their own and even further developing characters with new support conversations and paralogs. While the main character is pretty bland and the game misses on an opportunity to flesh out Byleth better, these are small misses in the grand scheme of the overall success that is the game's story. It's difficult to know where to start with the gameplay. Musou games remain one of the great enigmas of classification, as it's essentially a genre kept alive by one company. At their heart, they're action RPGs with an emphasis on simplicity, with simple 2-button combos and flashy special moves. They feed into a power fantasy of taking on entire armies on your own, but the struggle is figuring out how to build outward from that strong foundation. For a while, the Dynasty Warriors and Samurai Warriors franchises existed as a sort of if you like it niche, but in recent years, efforts like Hyrule Warriors and Persona 5 Strikers have brought the genre more towards the mainstream. Three Hopes is an example of why recent efforts have been more successful, in that there's been a concerted effort to cram as much gameplay depth as possible outside of the core combat. Outside of battle, there's numerous options to upgrade and customize characters. The freeform class system from Three Houses has been carried over, with each class line representing a different moveset. The classes themselves have passive skills as well as learnable skills that you can equip even once you move to a different class. These include both passives and combat arts, which are activatable abilities that you can use in battle. Characters have unique skills and 2 unique passives, all of which can be upgraded. There's a decent amount of depth here, as you'll sometimes send a character down a class line just for the skills you'll learn from mastering it. You'll also find a host of different weapons with different skills, and you can upgrade them as you move along or save your resources for when you reach the next tier of weaponry. But the real depth comes once you enter battle. While there were somewhat token efforts to adapt Fire Emblem strategy aspects in the first Warriors title, Three Hopes has done a much more thorough job. You can bring up to 8 characters into the main maps, with 4 of them being playable at any given time. You can command them to do a host of different things like attacking, defending, and healing. You'll need to do this frequently as the map moves along to take advantage of units having weapon triangle advantages over enemy commanders. The main difference from the previous title comes in the form of strategies you can implement at the beginning. These can range from building bridges to access areas earlier, changing formations, recruiting enemies, or deploying a squad of healers to protect important units. These are awesome. They were awesome in Spirit of Sanada, and they're awesome here. Combine these with the context that the story provides, and each battle feels significantly more unique, as if you're controlling turning points in an ongoing war as they happen. And speaking of controlling things, the main combat loop is as satisfying as ever. All of the game's systems serve to enhance the admittedly simplistic gameplay just enough that I never really minded the repetition. You'll be mowing down hundreds of enemies to build up special abilities and using those abilities to take down tougher enemies. Along with unique class abilities like the warrior's ability to smack the ground and make giant stone pillars appear, which somehow works even when you're indoors. Don't get me wrong, even with everything the game has added, it's still aggressively simplistic, and it's definitely not going to be to everyone's tastes. But this is as deep as a Musou title has ever been. It doesn't have as much moveset variety as Age of Calamity or the cosmically absurd number of stages of mainline Warriors titles, but it's probably the most complete experience the genre has ever seen. Fans of Musous will almost certainly love it, and if you're on the fence, there's a decent chance this game will convince you. It's tough for me to view Three Hopes outside of my personal expectations. As I said earlier, there were specific things I wanted to see in the game, and they were all met. I can't speak for anyone else's expectations, and mileage may vary, but from where I'm standing, Omega Force did a fantastic job recognizing the problems of its predecessors and how it could improve them. I don't know how you could have asked for any more. Thanks for watching. I know this is my third Fire Emblem video in a row, but we'll be doing something different next time. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a comment and check out my other stuff. I have a decent amount of videos now, and I check comments for old ones too.